Today we are jumping into one of the most controversial books in all of the Bible. Well, hey guys, what is up? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Austin, and I am so glad that you are here today, because today we are jumping back into our series, Life in the Word. After 2 weeks off, I am so excited to be back and going through the Bible with you. If you're new, Life in the Word is a weekly Bible study we do here on this channel, where we're committed to doing simple Bible study. We open up the Bible one chapter at a time, taking the best insights from scholars and applying it in real and practical ways. We seek to read the text in context and then see what that has to say to us in our modern context and how we can live that out and really be transformed by the Bible, which is so important. And if you're a Christian, that's something we all desire. So it's not just about learning, but it's about applying and living out. And if that interests you, I really encourage you to check in every week as we go through the Bible one chapter at a time. Like I said, today we are looking at one of the most controversial books in all of the Bible, and that is the letter of James. And if you want to follow along, we are in the book of James, which is all the way at the back of your Bible. It's between Hebrews and 1 Peter if you're new. And so I want to encourage you right now, before we get going, to go ahead and grab a Bible or grab a phone, flip over, whatever you got to do to the book of James, and go ahead and read chapter 1. I say this every week, but you will get so much more out of this video if you take the time to go ahead and read the chapter, because then you'll understand what we're talking about and it'll really come to life in a much more clear way. So I want to encourage you, go ahead and pause this video, take a second, read chapter 1, and then we will be right back. Well, I'm going to trust that you went ahead and did that. I hope you enjoyed it, whether that was the first time ever reading the Bible for you, or the first time reading James, or whether it was a refresher for you. I hope you enjoyed it. So something we're really passionate about in this series, Life in the Word, is reading the Bible in context. When we don't read the Bible in context, we run into all types of dangers, and we start to make the Bible say things that it was not supposed to say, and that is how we get in all kinds of theological trouble. So we want to be sure to read the Bible in context. This being the first episode in our James series, I want to take a little extra time to look at the context. Now, as we've talked before, there's a couple different layers to context. There's the historical context, like when was this book written, and the cultural context, like what kind of setting was this written in, what was the worldview of the people that would have been writing this and reading this, how would they have received it, which is really important to be asking. And on top of that, like who wrote it, where did they write it, when did they write it, all of those things. We also want to look at the literary context, and that can be, where in this written work are we? Are we at the beginning? Like, what's the flow of thought? How are things going? But also, like, what is the genre of this writing? What does that tell us about it? Because obviously you're going to read poetry differently than you're going to read a history textbook, or at least I hope you do, because that's how you read things well. So we have to pay attention to all of that. So we're going to take a little second here to dive into the book of James and see what is this that we're dealing with, so that we can read it wisely. So the first question obviously is well, who is this James guy? It's called James. I suppose the author's name was James, but James who? Well, and if you're wondering that, you're not alone, because scholars actually aren't fully decided on this. There were two prominent Jameses in the early church, and both of them have been proposed as potential authors for this book. The first is James the disciple, one of the 12 disciples, the brother of John, the beloved, who wrote the book of John, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, as well as Revelation. And he is the son of Zebedee, which is the coolest thing, like sons of thunder is what that means. But in any case, that is one person that has been proposed as a potential writer, because he would have been a prominent guy, and if he wrote stuff, it would have been copied down and people would have really respected it. Another potential author has been James, the brother of Jesus. And this is actually the author that most scholars point to today, at least most evangelical scholars, and say, yeah, we think it was him that wrote it. And that actually provides some really interesting context for us. Because if you remember from the Gospels, Jesus' brothers didn't actually believe in him. And prominent pastor Andy Stanley has often put this really well, and he's pointed to it as evidence for the transformation that the resurrection of Jesus had on people. he said, you look at James, the brother of Jesus, who grew up with Jesus, and like, what would it take for you to think that your brother was the Son of God, that was God in flesh? Like, if you grew up with someone, it's probably, chances are high, you're like, no way. And so early in Jesus' ministry, his brothers, James included, were like, nah, this guy is not God. Like, he's not. And then something happens, and he writes this letter where in the first verse, he says, James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. Like, what would it take for you to call your brother not just Lord, but God? Well, maybe it would take for him to predict and pull off his own death and resurrection. I mean, just maybe. And so when we look at it through that lens, it becomes really interesting. We get this backstory of the brother of Jesus who saw him and was maybe jealous about the popularity he was getting and just did not believe he was who he said he was. And then something happens. And all of a sudden he's calling his brother Lord and God. It's really interesting to think about in those terms. So if it was James, the brother of Jesus, that wrote this, then it would have had to be written before AD 62, which was when James died. But some indicators point that it was actually even earlier, that it would have been before AD 49, which is when the Jerusalem Council happened in Acts 15, where we see that question of how should the Christians deal with Gentiles becoming Christians? Like, did they have to become Jewish to become Christian? And we don't see any indicators of Gentile-Christian tension here, Gentile-Jewish tension in this letter. So some scholars say it must have been pre-49. We can't say for sure, but if it was, that would make it one of the earliest books of the New Testament. However, earlier I mentioned that there is some controversy with this book, and if you're not familiar with that, you might be like, well, why? If you read this chapter, I mean, it doesn't seem too controversial, and this content in the first chapter isn't as controversial as some that goes on, but it does have a pretty controversial history, much which I think really doesn't need to be so, but it's worth talking about. So famously, Martin Luther called the book of James the Epistle of Straw, and he did not see the gospel in it. He was not a big fan, and in fact, in his first translation of the New Testament, he put the book of James in as an appendix, which is a pretty big thing to do. Now, granted, Martin Luther, for all of his virtues, had a lot of vices and said some crazy things and was just quite the character. So, keep that in mind. But one of his things that we'll look at in following videos is that Martin Luther was really big on justification by faith. Sola fide. He was all in that all you need to be saved is faith, which has really shaped Protestant theology. And it's not the time to say that that's bad. Like, first of all, that's not what we're doing right now. And second of all, like, I'm a Protestant. Like, this is our theological heritage. But he sometimes lacked a little bit of nuance. And in the book of James, it talks about the importance of works. And gasp, some Christians go because they say, no, it's only faith. Well, we're going to look at that in future videos. But I just wanted to point out that it does have an interesting history. And it actually goes before that. Even before Martin Luther, James was one of the called disputed books of the New Testament. Most of the New Testament canon was agreed upon pretty early, by about AD 100 or by 140. You got the Muratorian canon, lots of interesting canon stuff we can talk about some other times. But there was a couple books that were a little disputed, like Hebrews because it was anonymous, you have James, 2 Peter because of style stuff, Jude, some weird stuff, and Revelation, just like how do we understand this book. Eventually, the book of James was accepted by the late 4th century. But with all of that, we come to this book that has had an interesting history, from its writer that could have been the brother of Jesus who once didn't believe in him, to it struggling to get acceptance because they weren't quite sure who wrote it, did it have apostolic authority, and then Martin Luther in the 1400s saying like, this book sucks. Like, what do we do, or 1500, sorry, with all of this? Well, we are going to jump in and see for ourselves, like, what is in this book. So now that we have that context, let's go ahead and dive in. There's 3 things I want to explore today, and we will look at them now. The first thing comes up really early on, and we see it in the first few verses. In fact, it's so timely that I really want to spend a little bit of time looking at this because I think it'll be super applicable to your life. So, in verse 2, we see, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. And going on, verse 3, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfast, verse 4, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Now, I don't know if you caught that in verse 2, but he says, count it joy when you meet trials of various kinds. Now, I don't know about you, but trials, like when bad things are going on in my life, I don't always see it as joy. In fact, I see it often as much the opposite. Like, no, this is not what I want happening in my life. I think that's a natural response. But James spins this on us and he says, no, actually count it as joy. Why, James? Well, because we have an eternal perspective on this. And we see that these things, that these trials, these difficult things that we're going through, we don't ask for them. We're not like, oh, bring me, like we're not masochists, like I want pain. But we're like, oh, when we go through this, we see that this is actually for our growth, for our development. You know, you could put it this way, that faith grows best when put to the test. Faith grows best when put to the test because that's how all skills are. You don't get good at things by just always doing the easy way. You don't get better at sports by only playing really bad teams. You know, it's like that common saying, bad seas make for good sailors. And in fact, I was thinking about that as I read this. Recently, I got my boating license and I've been learning all things about boating, how to dock, how to drive, like all those things. And when I go out on an easy day, I don't really necessarily learn that much. But when I go out on a rough day or when I'm trying to dock when it's really windy, well, that makes me better at it because that's when you really grow. It grows when it's put to the test. And your faith is the same way. Faith is easy when everything in your life is just going great and there's no problems. You don't necessarily need to lean on God. But you know what? Your faith really begins to grow when you meet those trials. And so what if we saw with an eternal perspective, that's what's really important. It's not our momentary comfort, but our long-term growth and our development, our transformation into the image of Christ. Well, what if we said, these trials that I'm going through, these are for my good. Actually, these are going to grow me because my faith grows best when it's put to the test. So I'm going to count it as a joy when I face these trials. And I know that's pretty radical, but what if we did that? Because if we truly believe what we're saying, if we truly believe that, you know, what's most important in our life is our relationship with Jesus, then we should look at anything that helps that as a good thing. It should bring us joy. And you know, in this season of coronavirus and all of the craziness that's going on in our world, a lot of people are facing really hard times. And it's difficult. I don't want to downplay your pain. I don't know what you've been through. And I'm sure some of you watching this video, maybe you've been through a whole lot. What if you tried this perspective shift? You said, you know what? These things, they hurt. They've been difficult. I'm not going to downplay that. But what if they're actually for my good? What if in some way these trials and this suffering, it can be redeemed? And I can see it as joy because it's helping me grow. It's a big challenge. I'm not going to say it's not, but I think that could make a big difference in your life. The second thing I want to look at in this chapter is a really famous verse, and as we go through James, you'll see that there's a lot of moral instruction. In fact, there's fascinating parallels between the book of James and the Sermon on the Mount. You can check that out on your own time. We won't have time to go into all of that, but it's really interesting. People have also called James like the Proverbs of the New Testament because it kind of takes a lot of the aspects of wisdom literature, even though this is a letter. So anyway, let's look at that. And I want to show you this verse that you've probably heard, but hopefully you can mine for even more application and transformation in your own life. And that is verse 19. It says, "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, or quick to listen, as many translations put it, slow to speak, and slow to anger." Quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. And you know, it's simple, and I don't think any of us should really have a problem agreeing with that. Like on the surface, it's like, yeah, like everyone should listen to people. That's a nice thing to do. You should probably listen before you speak. If you did that, you'd probably have a lot less regrets. And we should be slow to get angry. And same thing, like I probably wouldn't regret as many things if I took a little more time to get angry. Like if I wasn't so quick, if I didn't snap. Those are the things that cause us regrets. Those are the things that cause us to hurt people we care about. But while we agree with this on the surface, it's hard to put into practice. And in fact, I've made a video on this, talk less, listen more, gain wisdom, and I talked about this verse, and it's such an important principle as Jesus followers. Because as we practice the way of Jesus, as we practice living out as disciples and followers of Jesus, we can find that we have these bad habits. We find that we have these tendencies to get angry, that we don't listen to people. But really to be transformed, to really follow Jesus well and practice the way of Jesus faithfully, well, it all comes down to this idea of loving others well. Jesus summed up the commandments, all of the Old Testament, 613 commandments, into love God and love your neighbor. And in this, we love our neighbor through listening. And the way love and listening is connected is that love is saying you first, not me. And listening is saying, hey, I give you my attention and I allow you to speak rather than me to speak. It's a very simple act of putting someone else first. But it's difficult. While it's simple, it's not always easy, like many things in our life. But I want to challenge you with this. How can you this week be intentional about listening to others? Be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to get angry. It's simple, and I think it can really make a huge impact on your life and on your relationships and cause you to not have those regrets and not cause other people pain that you don't want to cause, but it's because you make those fast decisions. Slow it down. Be quick to listen, but slow to speak, and slow to get angry. All right, and the last point that I want to explore today comes from the last few verses of this chapter, starting in verse 22. It's another famous part of the book of James. There's a lot of things in James that are eminently quotable, tweetable, Instagram. I mean, they're great. But in verse 22, we find this. But be doers of the word, and not hearers only, deceiving yourself. Then he gives us this illustration. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he's like a man who looks intently at his natural face in a mirror. For he looks at himself and goes away and at once forgets what he looks like. But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. And then James gives us a picture of what he sees as true religion, which is really, really fascinating. He says, if anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. So we have a lot going on here, and I could talk about it for hours, but I don't want to do that. I want to let you get back to whatever you're doing today. But the thing I really want to hone in on here is this idea of being doers of the word and not hearers only, because I recognize in my own life that I struggle with this, and I see it in others, and I probably see it in others because I have it in me, the old you spot it, you got it thing. But I think it really is something that many of us struggle with, especially in this day and age. It's a lot easier to be a hearer than a doer. It's a lot easier to be a believer than a follower. So many of us settle with just saying yeah, I believe in Jesus. And James goes on later to say cool, even demons believe and shudder. It's dang, wow. That's a real just reality check for us. It's not just a matter of yeah, I believe Jesus is good and he seems cool and yeah, that's great. It's not even just a matter of I read books about Jesus. I listen to podcasts about Jesus. I'm a Bible college student. I go to church, I listen, I hear, I've been learning. All good things, not against it, but it's really about the rubber meeting the road. It's not just about knowing things about Jesus, but it's about knowing Jesus. And we really begin to know Jesus personally by living out lives of following Jesus. It's been said many times, and it's not original to me, but Jesus didn't go around and say, hey, come and believe about me. Hey, why don't you come and affirm these doctrinal truths? And I'm not against doctrine. I'm a theology major. I love this stuff. But what Jesus said to people was, come and follow me. Come and follow me. Walk in my footsteps. Learn my ways. That is what Jesus calls us to. We're not just called to learn stuff about Jesus. We're called to live a life of following Jesus. And that's a big difference. And it's one that we don't always get right. It's a lot easier for me personally to just learn stuff than to do stuff in all areas of my life. I mean, I can learn how to do any number of things on YouTube, but do I actually follow up and do them? I could learn everything there is to know about how to sail, but I don't have a sailboat and I don't have any intention of sailing anytime soon, so it's really not worthwhile information. And same with just learning stuff about Jesus. We can learn all these facts about Jesus, but if we don't give him our trust and align our lives with his way, then what what good is that for you? And what good is that for your neighbors? What good is that for the world and for the kingdom of God? I want to challenge you this week. How can you not just be a hearer, but a doer? And I want to challenge you with this very video. You know, we've gone over a lot of stuff. I've given you a lot of information, but is that information going to lead to transformation? Are these things that you've learned going to become things that you do? You know, we talked about being quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to get angry, and that's a great thing to know. You can memorize that verse, maybe put it to a song, like, oh, great, but are you going to do it? You know, we've talked about seeing trials as joy, realizing that your faith grows best when put to the test, but are you actually going to make that perspective shift? Because at the end of the day, if you don't, I mean, this is just 20 minutes of interesting information, but no transformation. And that's certainly not my goal for this. I don't think that's the goal for Jesus' teaching. I don't think that was James's goal when he sat down and wrote this, and it's not my goal for you, and I hope it's not your goal for your life, because this is about more than knowing stuff about Jesus. It's more than just believing in Jesus. It's about being a follower of Jesus. It's about walking in his footsteps, learning his ways, because his yoke is easy and his burden is light. You know, his way, it's good for us. He has the way that leads to life, but any way requires traveling, you know? You can look at a great road, but you're not going to experience that road if you don't drive down it. It's the same with your faith. Are you just going to sit in the car to admire the view, or are you going to take the keys and drive, following Jesus, experiencing the life that he created you to live? Because that's what I want for you, and more than what I want for you, that's what Jesus wants for you. So I hope you take that opportunity to not just be a hearer, but to be a doer. Well, thank you guys so much for watching this video. Truly, that means so much to me. I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that you learned things, but more than just learning, I hope that it gives you things to put into action. I hope it's not just information, but transformation for your life. Take one of these ideas, not even all three, just one, and apply it to your life this week. And then let me know how it went. I'd love to hear about it in the comments down below. And speaking of the comments, to all of you that have subscribed and have been commenting on these videos, liking, sharing them with your friends, seriously, like, that means so much to me, and I can't thank you enough. You guys are amazing, and it's an honor to do this with you. And to those of you that are new, this is Gospel Simplicity, a place where we're passionate about the beautiful simplicity and transformative power of the gospel, the good news about Jesus. We're out to talk about life, Jesus, and the journey of faith in a real, honest, and open way. So if that interests you and you haven't already, why don't you hit subscribe to become a part of the community here on this channel, to be a part of what we're doing. I'd love to have you along for the ride. But until next time, guys, be sure to be on the lookout for more videos, and as always, go out and love God and love others, because truly, above all else, that will change the world. Peace. I love you guys so much. I'll see you next time.